Hi, my name is Bob Sorensen. I'm a research vice president at IDC, and I have the pleasure of working with Earl Josephs and Steve Conway on their HPC team. And I'm here a little bit to talk about cybersecurity in the commercial sector. We'll narrow that down to a topic that I think would feel more interesting to the group here. But first, let me just tell you a couple of quick stories. A couple of months ago, I had the pleasure of visiting a large financial company. I can't say which exactly one it was, but I guess about 50% of you or more have one of their cards in your wallet right now. And we were looking at some of their security issues in terms of looking at both physical and electronic attacks. And the site was particularly impressive. First of all, you can't find it. It's kind of out in the hills of Virginia, and from a distance, it looks like it's a company warehouse, like something you'd see Walmart would have. So it doesn't even look like it doesn't even look like a data center from the outside. If you manage to crash through the front gate, you have to navigate this horrible road that's built at this wonderful angle that if you go down that road at anything above the speed limit, centrifugal force will pitch you off the road, roll you down a hill, and land you in a pond that the company put at the bottom, just so they'll know where you'll be at the end. If you walk through their data center, it is an odd data center because everything is spread out. It's not the kind of data center you see where everything is packed in. And we kind of asked them, we said, why is this giant room very sparsely populated with all the equipment you need? And they told us that what they had done was they had built this machine, they had laid out the floor plan of this based on the blast radius of a typical hand grenade. The idea being that if someone managed to smuggle a hand grenade into the building and let it off in the compute center, the system would still stay up and running because the equipment was spread around enough that there were no critical elements contained in one hand grenade blast radius. They had 5 separate telecom providers running into the compound, and the criteria was none of them could run their lines in parallel, so there was no opportunity for someone digging up the land to cut all 5 cables at once. So the 5 providers all had to bring in their services at 72 degrees difference within the site, so you had this maximum dispersion. They had all sorts of computer equipment. It wasn't that they were IBM or Dell or HP. They had IBM and Dell and HP because they said they didn't trust anybody completely. So they wanted to bring as many vendors into the building as possible. Despite that, as soon as a vendor brought a system into the facility, it was taken downstairs and it was ripped open and stripped apart to make sure that everything that was in that machine was supposed to be in there and nothing else. Their software protections were equally as rigorous. The bottom line is, on any given day, they had 25 to 50 well-paid cyber experts sitting there monitoring the financial transactions as they were coming through the system. And every analyst there, from the most senior person to the guy that had walked in the door 2 weeks before, had the ability to hit a big red button that stopped the entire process, that brought it to its knees if they felt that there was something interesting going on here. This was Class A security. And yet if you talk to the site manager, he freely admits that they are vulnerable, that they are not hack-proof. Someone can get in if they want to. And the entire philosophy of this place is based on, I don't have to outrun the bear, I just have to outrun you. The idea being their goal was to make sure that the hacker, whether the determined one or the casual one, said, I'm not going there, let me go to places like Target or Sony or Home Depot. Those guys are more vulnerable. That's the mentality. With that in mind, and that quick little story, which actually didn't turn out as quick as I hoped it would be, the idea that I'm talking about best practices in private sector cybersecurity isn't really right, because as these guys will tell you at this financial service, there's no such thing as best practices. We're not done. We haven't reached this ultimate cybersecurity regime now. So I like to think of it as we're talking about some of the least worst procedures out there at this point, because this is an ongoing battle. How we got involved in this particular study was we were contacted by a CIO who was in the process of moving his company from a very traditional kind of IT in the basement mentality, where all the big systems were down in the basement and all the access points to those were generally held within the confines of the various compounds where the company operated, and was moving more towards the classic kind of distributed, cloud-based far-flung, multi-access point kinds of infrastructures that we're seeing more and more today. And he just basically came in and said, can you give us a gut check? Have I thought about all the big problems? What are other companies doing out there? Am I missing something? Am I on track? Or are there things I need to address? And so really, he basically came in and said, can you just go out there and kind of survey the field to make sure that the folks that have already made this transition to this much more distributed, cloud-based mentality were doing the things that we probably needed to do or had made mistakes that we would like to avoid. And that's really how we got involved in this project. So this is not a cybersecurity briefing. I'm not going to be talking about anyone's favorite rootkit software packages or those kinds of things. This is much more of a 50,000-foot view of this study was much more of a 50,000-foot view of the issue. Really what we did was we wanted to conduct a number of case studies of commercial organizations that were doing cybersecurity, what problems they experienced, change they had made to address them, and some general, these kind of obvious questions that if you were the CIO of this company, you would really want them to answer. And really here, one of the major things that we wanted to do was start to think about the trade-offs here. You could have a very secure system. You put it in the basement of a building, you weld all the doors shut, and you don't have any wires leading out. That's a 100% secure system. It's just not very useful. What are the trade-offs between having a system that meets all of your business functions, including the ability to talk to anyone in the world that wants to do business with you, and do that in a safe environment? Also, some of the things that they were concerned about that were coming down the road. So really what we did is we created a series of open-ended questions. Unlike a lot of the surveys, and unlike some of the surveys that IDC generally does, where it's basically we're looking for significant numbers. We're looking to reach a number of people with a number of questions so we have statistically valid kinds of results. Here, this was really looking more towards engaging a smaller group of experts in much more substantive discussions. So the questions were open-ended. We wanted to survey key experts across a reasonable range of industries, but at the same time, we weren't looking for safety in numbers. We were looking more towards gathering some of the key insights from the people who would be in the best position to share them. Ultimately, we ended up having to do 14 in-depth interviews, talking with people basically on the phone most of the time. And most of them were, as I said, key experts in their field. It was really interesting. I interrupted one gentleman who was in the process of working on a project that he was going to make at a presentation at the Black Hat Hackers Conference in Las Vegas. I felt kind of happy I'd called him on a landline at that point because I didn't. The less contact with people who go to Black Hat, the better, to be quite honest. So we had these interviews, and ultimately, what I'm going to finally get around to today, or at this point, is now talking about some of the things that we gleaned from our conversations with these experts, and then the things that we passed along to the CIO that I referred to earlier. I mean, the main area of concerns when you talk to these folks out there, as I already alluded to, is the trade-off between security and easy access. You have to be able to do your business. That's first and foremost. If you want a completely secure system, maybe you can click to buy something on Amazon and they'll come back 4 days later and say the sale has been approved. That's really not a good business model. You want to have the information available in a reasonable length of time. The other concern here is access from network edges, and this is where the distributed environment is really becoming much more problematic. It's not just your company anymore. You have to deal with your supply chain who has their own cybersecurity infrastructure. You have remote employees out there. You have all sorts of other people who want to get into your network that are out there and aren't obviously within your easily controllable user authentication processes. The other concern out there right now is heterogeneity. People nowadays, when they join a company, why can't I use my iPhone? Why can't I use my Android? Can I use this device to access the system? It's no longer something that you can mandate to every employee. Here is the way you access our network. It's got to be much more flexible. It's got to be much more unpredictable. And it's going to have a number of operating systems. It's going to have a number of different mechanisms. You may be running some of your stuff on a public cloud, on a hybrid cloud, on a private cloud. It's all sorts. The complexities now of the different ways that you can basically architecture your distributed system creates all sorts of concerns from different kind of access points and the ability to control that in a nice, easy manner. We talked to the experts about the impact of recent major breaches. the ones most notable, like Target and Sony, and really what this did inside your company. And I thought this was somewhat surprising, is that basically whenever somebody else gets hit, the feeling is always better them than us. And it's really true that it doesn't really serve as a call to arms for a lot of these companies. In fact, it's almost the exact opposite. When somebody else gets hit, in a lot of what we consider to be low, sophisticated kind of companies, it was basically justification that what they were doing was right, even if they weren't doing all that much. So in some sense, we had companies who were basically saying, I've never been hit, and we really don't do too much, but what we're doing must be working because we've never been hit. And so, in essence, some of these highly visible breaches do nothing more than to build confidence in exactly the wrong kinds of companies. So it really is something to worry about here, this kind of lack of response. We asked who was in your industry is doing best at dealing with security, and some of the answers we got were the ones you'd expect. Happily, the FBI and the intelligence communities were reviewed as good. Financial service companies, large retailers, Walmart is considered to be very competent. Some of the large technology firms are out there. It's really the kinds of companies that you'd expect to at least be on ahead of the curve. The things that I thought were kind of scary is some of the worst universities, and there you could see those are open environments. You have lots of folks coming in and out. It's really about access. It's really not about security. That's to be expected. Some of the manufacturers and some of the public utilities cause concerns here, and the issue with manufacturers, I think, is most problematic because most manufacturers ultimately nowadays are part of an electronic supply chain, which means that you can be dealing with a company that is very sanguine with their cybersecurity infrastructure, and yet they may have a chain of a supply chain that may be 5 or 6 or 7 levels deep, and so the company at the top that thinks they have control of their cybersecurity may be 6 or 7 steps away from a company that they would otherwise never want to be doing business with, but they have to because of the supply chain complexities. That is something that I think really needs to be addressed as we move forward. So we asked, what are the companies that do best? What makes them do best? And I thought this was a little self-serving, but the bottom line is if you ask a bunch of cybersecurity experts what it takes to be secure, they'll say, hire cybersecurity experts and pay them an awful lot to do it. You can't argue with the logic, but it is out there. They said you have to hire the top talent out there. You really can't cut corners here. Now, the other thing, of course, is you have to do all the proven methods. You have to do everything out there that everyone else is doing. Redundant controls, not giving anyone full control. The idea of multi-level security we heard time and time again. Just an interesting aside, I know Cray was in here yesterday and talking about running multi-level security on Cray computers, and I read a fascinating article a couple weeks ago that talked about the fact that when the US military drops special force guys in horrible places, like say if you're going to drop them in Afghanistan or Pakistan or other nations, those guys don't go in first. There's a small group of gentlemen in the Special Forces who are not only Special Force guys, but they are also meteorologists. You can't send in Special Force guys if you don't know what the weather's going to be like for the next 3 days, because you have to land them using aircraft. So there are a small group of people in Special Forces who are not only fully trained Special Force experts, but they are also trained meteorologists who gather data on the ground and ship it back to do local tactical weather forecasting before you can even begin to put the standard pointy end of the spear on the ground in a special force operation. And I thought this is exactly the kind of requirements. These guys gathered the data on the ground, and they're going to be shipping it back to Cray on a Cray system to do kind of a multi-level security covert operation for things like weather forecasting. And I just thought that was an actually fascinating kind of example of how more and more cybersecurity becomes part of the operations of places that you don't even think about. The interesting thing, we asked them how they deal with insider threats, and more respondents were worried about hacking than insider threats, although they see them important. One of the interesting caveats here is that when a lot of people think about the outside kind of threats, they think more about the ones that come in and basically soil the nest, if you will, that create havoc, that leak information. The big concern out there right now is the quiet hacker, the guy that gains access to your systems and slowly bleeds you dry over the period of a couple years and gets access to your data and is doing something with it that affects you commercially in a way you don't even know about. So the idea of the blatant outside intruder, in some ways that can be the most upsetting, but maybe not nearly as financially devastating as someone who comes in and spends a lot of time there and really extracts value. God Lord, I really hate that clock. It's moving way too fast. How do you trade off between better security costs and business disruptions? Most companies want better security, but they're not willing to pay for it. And I thought this was a really interesting conclusion that we heard from more than one company. The companies that really deal best with setting up a cybersecurity infrastructure are the ones that have already been hit, simply because the people that make the decisions about writing checks now can do an accurate risk assessment. They know what the financial implications are of a cyber attack. And they can say, great, this happened, we lost this amount of money, we can now spend this amount of money to counter it. The ones that have never been hit have a very difficult time attaching a dollar value and doing a risk assessment. And we heard that from a number of folks, that and a lot of times it pays to have a cybersecurity team and a guy at the top that really knows about IT and cyber, but the guy that goes to talk to the board that says we need money to do this shouldn't be a tech guy, he should be a money guy. So he can talk to the board in terms that talk about how they can commit funds to deal with these problems. I thought that was another interesting takeaway. It's not worth encrypting everything. Some people do it, but it's really not an issue. The most important security threat for your organization today is bring your own device and everything else outside the firewall, which is now becoming almost a standard kind of infrastructure nowadays. The bring your own device thing is problematic, and it's going to get even worse, and it keeps a lot of people up at night. Best practices to address security threats today: use proven methods, redundant controls, stick to the standards, install all of the updates you can. One of the interesting things is no one's doing very good real-time monitoring at this particular point in time, except some of the financial houses. And there's very little being done right now in taking data analytics to find some of the interesting cyber threats in-house. I think that's going to change soon, but it's definitely not a lot being done in that area. Measuring effectiveness is your program. Another metric: if you haven't been hit, how can you tell if you're being successful or just lucky? There needs to be a lot more work done on metrics to figure out if what you're doing is exactly right. And as I already said, analytics and cybersecurity. Once a breach occurs, you should have a plan in place long before a breach occurs. That's the bottom line. You shouldn't be reacting. People shouldn't be explaining phone calls. Shouldn't be dealing with phone calls an hour and a half after something hits, a bunch of websites that you've been hacked. There should be a plan in place long before that happens. Before we get to the questions, when we presented all of this to the CIO, we boiled it down to this one page, two-sided kind of template, if you will, to basically say, here's kind of the conclusions we found. And he was really taken with this from a notional standpoint. And when we finished up, we said, well, do you want complete control of this? He said, no, what I would appreciate is if you circulated this to as many folks as you could out in the real world, and if we could use this to build off of. So we made this available today, not just because I think it actually contains some interesting information and insights, but also just basically to say, if you have additional comments or thoughts, if you think something here is worth further enhancing, if you think something here is 100% wrong, or anything in between, drop one of us a note at IDC, and we'd be more than happy to really start to make this more of a kind of a living document that progresses as both sides of the equation, the cyber guys and the cyber protectors, become more sophisticated. If we can keep this as an ongoing dialogue, I think that would help kick the can down the road a little bit about cybersecurity. So take a look at it. Glean whatever information you can. And if you have any comments about it, please just send me or Earl or Steve just a note to kind of just give it a sense of where it's going. But by all means, share this with your cyber folks if you care to. And that's about all I'm going to have now. So there's the email addresses for that stuff.
Okay, thank you, Bob.